Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Mercedes cannot afford their B-spec version of the W14 to fail when it arrives on track in a few weekends time in Imola. But what aerodynamic concept are they going to base this version of the car on? What's it going to look like? Is it going to be an evolution of their current concept? Total Wolf says no. Logic would say they should base it on the Red Bull, but there are some rumours emerging that it's more likely they look closer at the Aston Martin, the second fastest car on average so far this season, sharing some components with Mercedes. If they can take the good elements of the Aston Martin with the good elements of the current W14, that might be their key back to fighting with Red Bull. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Firstly, another update on the Ferrari drama of the last few days. If you guys missed it, Lapo Alcan, brother of John Alcan, president of Ferrari, said it's time to wake up, Ferrari. Enough with these politics and games. Like this, we shall never win. Now, it seems like actually John Alcan himself gave a letter today to owners or shareholders of the group that joint owns Ferrari and Juventus, and basically was talking quite a lot about Juve, but also discussed Ferrari and said deep changes are underway between the walls of Maranello, particularly in strengthening sporting activity on the track. The desire to progress that our founder Enzo Ferrari had in his heart continues to keep Ferrari's people humble and ambitious in shaping the future of the prancing horse, but effectively saying that things are happening, things are changing, and well, it will not be how it was before. Now, let's be honest here, we've heard all this talk from Ferrari before the season began. The car is unprecedented in terms of speed, all this stuff, and well, certainly unprecedentedly bad compared to last year's car. So whether these are empty words, empty promises, we shall see, but still rumours emerging that things are going to change significantly at Ferrari, and I think they need to if they really want to be a serious team over the next few years. Also, big update on Sebastian Vettel. This is just kind of a rumour and a theory from Ted Kravitz, but it does maybe make sense that in some point in the future, Sebastian Vettel might return to Red Bull. There's been a lot of optimism about this possibility. Helmut Marko is going on 79, 80 now. You'd imagine he retires in the coming years. He might not. He might just stay around for longer as their kind of chief advisor, let's say, and working a lot with the youth projects and elsewhere. But Ted Kravitz reckons, I think he'll come back to Red Bull. I think he'll replace Helmut Marko as a sort of motorsport advisor. That'd be quite a nice role for Seb, I think, and it's at least an interesting possibility to contemplate. Speaking of Germany, Hockenheim, we saw yesterday, interested in a return, but they don't want to be financially ruined by this, so they're contemplating a kind of partnership with the Nürburgring where they would alternate. So they would effectively go 1 year at Hockenheim and then the next year potentially at the Nürburgring and then alternate like that. So you could have a German Grand Prix, but it wouldn't be at one circuit every year. It's an interesting idea, but Matt, there are a lot of circuits and a lot of countries that want to Formula 1 Grand Prix. They are spoilt for choice, F1, and next year I would be surprised if there isn't 25 races on the calendar, to be perfectly honest. Let's discuss Mercedes then, because the W14 got its first podium of the season, of course, back there in Australia a couple of weekends ago now. Looks the most competitive it has done so far this year, but historically Australia not super representative of how the season might go on other tracks. There were some caveats as to why Red Bull were marginally slower that weekend to what they might usually be, and on average the Aston Martin has still been the second best car to the Red Bull, significantly behind, but still far ahead of where people expected them to be, with a concept that has clearly taken some inspiration from the Red Bull, but is not a Red Bull copy, right? People, if you actually look at the Aston Martin, the way the side pods are designed, yes, there's some Red Bull inspiration, but part of it is inspired by last year's Ferrari. Even part of the Aston Martin is inspired by last year's Mercedes, especially in the way the rear of the car is designed, which is maybe not optimal for straight line speed, just like the W13 wasn't. The W14, though, better in a straight line than last year's car. Yes, the DRS isn't as powerful because the aero just straight up isn't as efficient as the Red Bull's is, but in a straight line, the Mercedes is only 2.5 kph off the Red Bull without DRS. With DRS, it's a different story. But if you were to take the best elements of the Aston Martin and the best element of the Mercedes, you might have a car that would get relatively close to the Red Bull, and that might be what Mercedes have to consider doing, because copying the Red Bull design is going to be a challenge at best and probably doesn't really work in terms of catching up to these guys, especially considering the budget cap. Even this year and last year, Chauvelin has said from Mercedes that copying isn't really going to work. First of all, the copy is never going to be as good as the original anyway, and it's going to take much longer to catch up and have the understanding of the Red Bull that Red Bull presently do. And even as he said quite recently, the side pods are a similar theme, but if you change and copy somebody else, you're going to go backwards before you go forwards, and even when you do start going forwards, you're still going to be behind where they are. And even last year he said that they're not going to try and copy from another team. They're going to look to evolve their concept. They did. The zero pods, again, haven't really proved to have worked, so they will now abandon the zero pods, go down a different direction, but, copying the Red Bull, I don't think is the most likely possibility. The more likely possibility, according to some sources around the race and other analysis, suggests a possible hybrid model, or at least looking very closely at what Aston Martin have achieved, because to go from where Aston Martin were last year to the car they've turned up with here is a massively impressive feat, especially when Aston Martin are a customer team of Mercedes. The idea, I mean, frankly, it's embarrassing, right, for Mercedes that a customer team of theirs that buys the entire rear suspension and the engine and the gearbox from Mercedes has done a better job with that than the Mercedes guys have themselves. But if anything, that should be promising for Mercedes. They know that Aston Martin have achieved something very impressive given the time and resources they've had for this car, and it's still early in the Aston Martin's development life cycle with some of their parts, and the front suspension, which Aston Martin themselves have designed, that is where the secret seemingly is unlocked, and that's how Aston Martin is able to go through the corners and in the traction zones pretty much as good as the Red Bull is. It loses out a lot on the straights, the Aston Martin, but if you were to take the front end of the Aston Martin, whatever they're achieving there in the suspension, plus the relatively decent straight line performance of the Mercedes, you'd have a pretty competitive car. And of course, the advantage of Mercedes looking closely at the Aston Martin is that they know that half of that car is pretty much the same as theirs. So there's less work to be done in terms of what to change. They know that half of the Aston Martin is the rear suspension, the engine, the gearbox, and everything that the Mercedes has. So they can be more confident, let's say, that the side pod design, the floor design, the front suspension design that they might be going with is also potentially viable for the Mercedes itself. This season, part of the reason why the straight line speed is better is because this is the new spec rear wing. This is the older spec at the bottom here. I mean, it was a bit of a barn door on the back of the car. They're definitely faster this year in a straight than they were previously. Aston Martin have still struggled from that though. And it was clear when Aston Martin turned up with their revised concept last year that they've now doubled down on this year, that the side pod concept change has been quite significant, but it does carry some Ferrari elements, some Red Bull elements, even some Mercedes elements, and it has many of the Mercedes components itself. Wolff has also effectively said that the zero pods are going to go. It's going to be more conventional side pod approach going forwards, and it might be more similar to the Aston Martin, right? If you think about it, a customer team, the gap they should have to the main team should be kind of the gap that Aston Martin presently have to Red Bull. So there's an argument that Mercedes might look at Aston Martin, the fact that they're only a few tenths behind. This was the race pace in Bahrain, excluding the first stint, and Red Bull were doing a lot of management here and just driving to times, but Aston Martin were only, okay, let's say they're maybe 5 tenths off the Red Bull or something, maybe they're 7 tenths off the Red Bull, but on average over the first few races, Aston have been relatively competitive, certainly in the hands of Alonso. So you would think the gap that Aston have to Red Bull is kind of what you might expect a customer team to have to the main team. So Mercedes might look at Aston and think, damn, well, if they're achieving that with part of our car that shouldn't be so efficient for them to produce with, we should be able to do as well as Red Bull are. And Aston Martin obviously have done a killer job here, but there is an argument to say that, look, these side pods here for the Mercedes just aren't working. They can't run the car as close to the floor as they thought they could to unlock the performance. Their car is super stiff in terms of suspension. When they raise their car up a fraction, it doesn't help out. And the Aston Martin design with these side pods, where the airflow goes underneath and creates these beautiful vacuum effects that we have seen on the Red Bull, and probably works as well on the Aston Martin, is potentially the way to go. So copying Red Bull for Mercedes is probably a death sentence. In terms of being able to catch up, they're going to have to take a slightly different tack that is slightly more Mercedes inspired, and therefore might be Aston Martin inspired as well. So intrigued to your thoughts on that in the comment section below, because there was lots of discussion recently about the Mercedes gearbox and the rear end of the car that isn't helping the Aston Martin, but also fundamentally Mercedes therefore know that, well, if their rear end is the same as our rear ends, then it must be something at the front suspension that's giving them the advantage in the corners and in the traction zones, and that gives Mercedes a better chance to actually solve their problems. Of course, Mike Elliott and the technical team cannot afford this to go wrong. This is their final chance, really, you could argue, of trying to catch up to Red Bull. They need this car concept, the W14-B as people are dubbing it, to work when it comes down to Imola in a few races time. And when it finally arrives, we will get to see who it's been inspired by, and some people reckon Aston Martin is the most likely, and even Max Verstappen says he reckons Alonso will claim number 33, victory number 33 in his career this season. Of course, Verstappen, I'm sure, would like it to be after he has the championship sewn up, but it'd be great if Alonso won in Spain, wouldn't it? That would be a great story. maybe not going to happen, but we'll see. I think realistically it's got to be towards the end of the year where teams are going to have more chance to beat Red Bull. Maybe not the case though if there's chaos and other situations that unfold. Also just wanted to look at the fact that, well, the Red Bull have kind of dominated the season so far. Not exactly a massive surprise, but look at these numbers by comparison. Laps led after round 3, Verstappen and Perez take up 151 of those laps, and it's Russell, Hamilton, Alonso with barely a dozen. So, I mean, yeah, obviously this is expected, but still, teams need to figure this out quickly, what they're going to do to catch up to Red Bull. And just a final thing to mention for you guys, I thought this was quite cool. Autosport put this analysis together of what the cars look like today compared to the cars of 2 decades ago, back in 2003. So today, the cars are an entire meter longer than they were 2 decades ago, and another 20 centimeters wider. And I must say, I did much prefer the cars when they were smaller, more nimble, more agile, when you can actually fit them too wide through the center S's, which nowadays isn't really going to happen. There's many other corners like that as well that either aren't corners anymore because the cars have so much downforce, or just you can't fit 2 cars through there because they're so big and bulky nowadays. I mean, they're absolutely massive, 5.5 meters long. You don't really get a perception of that until you see one in real life. And okay, they were still pretty big back in the day, but this is just a comparison of what the current spec would look like if they were smaller as they were back in the day. Rumor does have it that come 2026, when the new regulations come into effect, one of their key goals is to make the cars smaller again and a little bit more nimble, but they've got to obviously maintain the safety factor that these bigger cars have. So I don't exactly think they're going to take a significant step back like this, but hopefully come 2026 the cars are maybe even 50 centimeters shorter, just something relatively significant that would make the cars look a little bit less humongous than they are today. But very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.